Hey everyone, Erik Gist here with this week's Watts Weekly. What I want to talk a little bit about today is mark making, or more specifically, how to study mark making. It can be a little bit difficult thing to study because books are great for studying a lot of things: compositions, color harmonies, just ideas, inspiration. They're great for that. But one of the things they don't really show you that much is mark making, because generally the paintings and drawings or inkings or whatever are reduced down to such a scale that a lot of that is lost. In fact, it's one of the things that gets lost the most from great artists, because their subtle sense of design gets lost in the reduction process. So it can be a difficult thing to study. One of the best things you can do, obviously, is get out and see some original artwork in museums or art shows or conventions or what have you. That's one of the best things to do. The problem with that is that once you leave, you're trusting in your memory. Nice thing is now we all almost always have phones in our pockets with cameras on them, so you can always take those out and snap some shots, if it's allowed. Or you can even take your camera out with you, your SLR out with you, and take some nicer photos. So those are some great things to do, but depending on where you live or what your resources are, you don't always have access to good shows like that. Living in Southern California, it can be a little bit hit and miss. There's been some better shows lately in LA, and even a few years back there was quite a few at the San Diego Museum of Art. So that was really helpful to me when I was a young painter, because I didn't really quite fully understand what that meant. I heard people talk about it, but generally speaking, what I got to see were, even from good painters like Jeff, were quicker studies, which are great to see, and the spontaneity of the mark making and painting from shorter studies from life, 3-hour studies from life, is great, but it's not the same thing as seeing a finished, finessed studio painting. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is some of the things you might want to look into to help you study the mark making or brushmanship, or whatever you want to call it, design sense, to help you with your artwork. And this translates over into all medium. Good mark making is good mark making. It doesn't matter if it's watercolor, oil, digital, inking. It doesn't really matter that much. I mean, there's certain idiosyncrasies to each medium that make them unique, but for the most part, good mark making is good mark making. So when I was younger and my resources were limited, one of the things that I started really looking into was good quality oversized prints from my favorite artists. So I started hunting around a lot for that type of thing, and I started finding some by some of my favorite artists like John Foster. So these are pretty good sized prints. In fact, I wouldn't go any smaller than that, especially since John paints fairly large. This painting, I don't know how big the original is, if it says on there, but I'd be surprised if it was smaller than 20 by 30, and this print is only about 12 by 16 or 11 by 17, something like that. But still, it's big enough that I can start to see some of the texture and some of the smaller brushmanship in the piece. But ideally, it's good to get even some larger prints. Like this is probably even the size of the original. This is a James Bama Doc Savage, and I think if this isn't the size of the original, it's pretty darn close. That's a good sized print that's probably second best to actually getting to see the original. You can see most all the texture. You can even see the texture of the board that he's painting on, which is nice, and you can see that it's some sort of gessoed surface, like gessoed masonite or something along those lines, and not stretched canvas. So the print is good enough for that type of thing. You can see this one's pretty beat up, because I'll have these out a lot while I'm painting, and I even get paint on them. So I'm not too precious about them. I should take better care of them, but when something's in my studio, it's bound to get paint on it eventually. And during different phases of my development, I'll look at these or even do master studies from these larger prints. And as I said, I looked around a lot and found some that aren't all that common. Some of them you can find pretty much anywhere. You can find them at conventions, but some are a little bit rarer, and you can see this one's really beat up. This was one of the first ones I got, and I studied a lot from it to try and learn Phil Hale's brushmanship. You might not be able to see it in the video here, but this is large enough, again, even though not anywhere near as large as his original, that I can see all the little subtle color harmonies, and the brush strokes don't get lost in the reduction yet. Some of it may, but most of it's still there, especially since he's a slightly looser painter, at least for an illustrator. My buddy Dave Wilkins had these at his last signing, and I picked one up. It's really interesting to see his digital brushwork on it. Again, that gets lost when it's reduced down to comic book size, but this is a pretty good size print, especially for a digital print. I can see enough of his thought process and some of his hatching and things like that in there. I can even start to decipher maybe what brushes he uses, although I think Dave uses a pretty limited brush set and just relies more on his drawing and painting skills. But stuff like that is really good. Then you can start getting up into a slightly higher range. These collectible signed print sets that I got from the Insomnia book, and again, these are big enough that I can start to see some of his brushwork. Not as good as seeing the original, but you know, at least I can take them home with me and I can have them out in my studio while I paint. As I started to get a little further along in my career, and my work was good enough to warrant it, or I started making some friends with with some of the artists that I did admire, I was able to start trading for work, or in the case of Jeff, we're really good friends, and he's gifted me a couple paintings over the years, so I get to have some of these out in my studio to really study some of Jeff's studio paintings, which, you know, I get to see every once in a while, but usually, you know, when Jeff does a studio painting, it's off to a gallery or off to a show, and I don't really get to scrutinize over it that much. And again, it's a different level of finesse than what you see in a live painting. So it's nice to see the kind of more finished finesse that he puts into a finished painting, and I love this painting. I was pretty lucky to get that one, because as soon as he did it, I kind of fell in love with it. So. But it's nice to have it around the house and be able to look at, not just for inspiration, but also to learn from. Then there's some of my other favorite painters. One from Glenn Orbick, one of his finished illustrations from a project that I was actually fortunate enough to work with him before he passed away. And again, you know, having this in person and getting to see it, the only other time that you'll get to see this in reproduction is part of a game. And it's shrunk down to card size, so you don't really get to see the thought process or the brushmanship or the mark making or the design anywhere on it. So very helpful to have those around. In this case, you can even see some of the drawing showing through from the sides, so that can be helpful as well. And that's another thing that sometimes you can see in originals that's a little bit more unique, is that sometimes you can even see the drawing showing through or the underpainting showing through. Things that you don't normally get to see that much in a reproduction. Especially if it's reduced down, you lose a lot of that. But again, you see the originals, you get to see the surface that it's painted on, you get to see where the texture is coming from. Is that part of the ground? Is it part of the application of paint? Is it part of the brush usage? All these things can create a different effect, and there are things that you don't really get to see as much in reproduction. You can take a guess after a while, but that only comes from seeing original artwork or higher quality prints like G Glaze and things like that, that you can learn a lot from. Sometimes you'll go to a workshop and the teachers will offer the demos, and this is one from Calvin Liang that my wife and I took a workshop with him, and seeing the color harmonies in this. His work is phenomenal, and I've seen a lot of it in galleries, but again, once it's gone, it's gone. We have a book on him, but reproduction, something gets lost in the colors in reproduction, whereas getting to see this in person, I can start to push some of those reflected light colors that again get lost in reproduction. So I try to remember it when I see them in person, and that's a very valuable thing to do, is go see the original artwork, but it's not the same as being able to see it in person. A piece from John Foster that I constantly have up in my studio. This was a demo that he did at a workshop that he gave at the school, and I was fortunate enough to attend, and I traded for his demo. But again, getting to see the brushmanship in here, this is something that just gets lost in reproduction. Seeing the places where he uses thinner and thicker paint, letting some of that warmth from the board or the stain coming through the black and white painting is really neat to see. And again, just gets lost in reproduction or online. So those are some of the things that you want to start looking for as you become a more mature painter, is going and seeing work in person or getting higher quality prints, things like that, and try to absorb those things that you can't get out of reproduction. It's always nice to see paintings in person, but try to, in a way, try to push down that awe a little bit. I'm guilty of this as much as anyone, is getting my fanboy on, and when I see the artwork, I'm just sort of dazzled by the fact that I'm getting to see that piece of artwork in person. But then taking a moment to look and absorb and try to visually memorize those things that you can't get out of a book, that you can't get off of the internet, that you can't get from anywhere else other than seeing that original piece of artwork, and trying to get some of that same feel into your work as well. And a lot of that comes from the brushmanship or mark making. Again, use of thick and thin paint, use of subtle color harmonies, different ways of creating an edge. Are you blending, or are you smudging together, or are you tiling? All these things, again, especially in someone like Norman Rockwell, every time I get a chance to see one of his pieces in person, I try to burn it in my memory as much as possible, because he does all those things, and he'll do them at different times for different reasons, to create a texture, or to create lack of texture, or to create an atmosphere or a mood, or whatever it might be. It's very conscious. Nothing happens by accident. It's very calculated in his work. And while I maybe don't necessarily want to be as calculated as him, I want to know how he did these things. And the only way to do that is sometimes seeing the original artwork. So getting to see the original artwork. If you can't get a chance to see original artwork, try to get some high quality prints, and eventually maybe even become a collector yourself and get some originals, so that you can have them around, save up, and even just buying one and having it up in your studio can be immensely helpful. So that's kind of what I want to talk a little bit about today, is not becoming too much of a fanboy when you get a chance to see original artwork, or don't downplay the importance of seeing original artwork, or as close as you can to that. I think it was Boris Vallejo one time in an interview talked about how when he was a young student, he thought that his work was of a professional quality because he was painting from reproductions, and he thought that his original paintings were as good as the reproductions. And then when he finally went to a convention or a show and he got to see some of the artwork in person, he realized how far away he was, because his originals just weren't holding up to their originals. So much was lost in reproduction, that he realized he needed to ratchet down a little bit more and try to improve the look of his originals, because he knew however good his originals were, they were going to look about 70-80% as good in reproduction if you're lucky. So the better you can make them, the stronger that you can make your originals, the more sophisticated, the more refined you can make your originals, the better they're going to reproduce. Just wanted to kind of address that a little bit, and don't rely too much on reproduction, and try and get out and see original artwork as much as you can, or even get a hold of one yourself if you're fortunate enough to. Good luck. Thanks for joining me on this week's Watts Weekly, and get some painting done.